Hello, thank you for joining me. Today I'd like to talk about the topic of what to do with thread ends when you are making tatted rings or tatted rings and chains. There are, in my opinion, 4 different ways to deal with these situations. The first would be tatting over the ends. If you are making a rings only flower or pattern and you come to the end or you run out of shuttle thread, you would take the end of your old thread, tie a square knot as close as possible to the base of your last ring with your new thread. So now you have 2 threads, 2 ends, plus your shuttle. You're going to start your next ring, pretending you're just going to hold these out of the way. Take your pinch, wrap your thread around your hand, and now you have your ring around your hand and in your pinch. Now these ends here, you want to position them so that they lie right along with the core thread that you're going to be covering up with your knots. So the first half of the first stitch of your ring, you see you've flipped, you take your ends, lay them over that loop, and pull them through the loop. So now they are lying right next to your core thread. Pull your half of your stitch as close as possible to the base of your ring, holding those ends there. Usually what I do is cut them a little shorter. Now you're doing your second half of the stitch, which is over. You flip it, and your loop is lying over your ends. You bring the ends up through the loop, hold them with the core thread, pull that stitch tight, and now you have your first stitch that's sliding on your core thread, but your ends are also included along that core thread. So we're going to do that again. You hold your ends with your core thread, you do the first half of the stitch, there's your loop, position your ends over that loop, take them down through the loop, hold them, pull your first half close. Now you're going over to do the second half. You can see that loop is falling over your ends. You bring them up through the loop. So they are following your core thread. We'll do that one more time. First half, down through the loop, pull. Second half, up through the loop, pull. So now your ends have been secured. Now they're already secured with that square knot at the base of the ring. Then you have 3 stitches that were formed over that. And this particular pattern is, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8. This pattern is 3, 8, 3. So we've done 3. You hold your shuttle thread out of the way, and you cut your ends off as close as possible without cutting your shuttle thread, and you make your shuttle or your picot join there. So now we're going to, no, sorry. Make your join. And when you pull that loop out and you're pulling the thread close, you've just hidden that cut. So now you make your rest of your ring, 1, 2, 3, and your ends are gone, and they're hidden right there in your first 3 stitches. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, picot, 2, 3. Close your ring. Okay, that is how you hide ends by tatting over them if you are doing rings only. If you are doing a pattern that is rings and chains, you want to make sure that if you are going to tie on, you do make sure you are tying on right before you do a ring. You never want to tie on right at the beginning of a chain, because the chain is not as well anchored, and if you are putting your ends here and you start pulling on this, it has a tendency to come apart. So if you are running out of your shuttle thread and you don't think you're going to have enough to do the next ring, cut this off, leave enough to tie a knot, and you tie your next knot, you tie your next shuttle on to the base right next to where you want your next stitch to be. You tie a square knot. It's a bit fiddly, but you can do it. Tie your square knot, pull it as tightly as possible next to your chain, and here are your ends. You hold those out of the way while you're doing your next ring. Start your ring around your hand, and if you want, cut off your ends just a little bit so they're not too unwieldy. Take your first stitch, hold that. No, I'm sorry. Put your ends through that loop first, and then pull it as close as possible. Second half, up through. There's your first knot, first double stitch. Here's your second one. The ends are on top. Take them down through. Hold them next to the core thread. Pull that. Second half. Up through. Pull that. And this pattern is 4, join, 4, picot, 4, picot, 4. So we need to have 4 stitches here and then a join. So I've done 2. And usually what I do is I'll do 3, cut off the ends, and then 4, then the fourth one. So there's the first half, second half up through, pull. So now I've done 3, and I need 1 more before the join. I'm going to cut those ends off just so they're more out of the way and hidden before the join. So we do the fourth stitch, make our join, and continue on with your ring. That way the ends are secured within a ring, and when you start pulling on them, they're not likely to come out. If you secure before the beginning of a chain, they're more likely to come undone. So there is the second example for tatting over ends. The next technique for hiding ends would be sewing them in. And the ability to do this is based upon the size of the thread and the size of the needle you're using. This is size 3 thread, and I have a relatively sturdy needle because you want to make sure you can pull on that tightly. If you can see, I placed the needle through the top of the stitch there with one of the ends after you've cut off your ends from your motif. And you just work that through. And start pulling on that so it's lying along the stitches. And this is on the back of the work. Okay, your next stitch, there's this little top part of the stitch. Put your needle through there, pull that through, pull the thread through. And usually I take 2 or 3 stitches this way, and then cut that off. And I forgot to say, after you make your motif, before you start sewing in the ends, you tie your ends together in a square knot. So now you've done the first end, you thread up your needle, and on the other side of the ring, you sew those in here. Now, with this size thread, it's relatively easy to do and pull on and see. That's why I mentioned the size of the needle. If you are using size 20 thread, which this is, obviously you're going to use a much smaller gauge needle. You can still do it, but you're going to have to perhaps use a magnifying glass to see the top of your stitch to pull that through there. And because the stitches are smaller, you might have trouble getting the doubled thread through there. So it's just a matter of experimenting. I like this method because it's easier to do, but I also have done enough tatting. I usually cover my ends up as I go, but it is something to practice, because you might find that sewing in the ends is what you prefer. The third technique is, once you have your motif done, you cut off the ends after you tie a knot, cut off your ends, and place a drop of glue there on the back. This would work well for earrings, a pattern or an item that isn't going to have a lot of stress and you're not going to see. You could put a drop of glue there, or you could sew the ends in there and glue it. If, however, you are going to glue them onto something, you can tie a knot, cut off the ends, and then glue them down. And because they're going to be glued and not shown, you don't really have to do anything else besides gluing them. So those first 3 techniques. The fourth technique is cutting off the ends and sewing them onto, say, for example, if you're going to make a brooch or an ornament, you have your item here, and you have the choice you can either cut off, you tie your knot and cut off both ends close and use a matching sewing thread to sew that on, or once you tie the knot, cut off one end short, leave the other end long, and use that tatting thread to sew your flower onto the piece. And that way you're guaranteed to have a matching color thread. Okay, those are the 4 techniques I wanted to talk about. A couple other things I wanted to mention. This was actually a question someone asked me. If, say, you are working on a piece and you make a mistake and you want to cut off at a certain part so that you can correct the mistake. I'm going to go back to the example of tatting over the ends. If you're going to cut off anywhere on tatting, you want to, well, it depends on if you have the choice where to cut. If you don't have the choice where to cut, okay, we're just going to cut this chain. Technically, what you have to do is you have to unravel and get to a point where you can retat a ring. So we've cut that chain, and you can see the chains unravel rather easily without much help. But if you have to cut, say, from a round motif or a doily, the other part of this question would be if you have a doily that you want to reduce in size or cut out a portion of, and you want to use that then to sew onto something else, how do you cut it so that you don't have a lot of ends to sew in? So if I have this piece here and I want to save this round inner smaller part and I want to cut this part away, you can see these rings are joined to these picots here. You want to make sure you're not cutting any of the picots on this round. So to cut this off, you're just going to cut through this ring, and once you start unraveling that, it comes off. And if you would want to fix a mistake here, then what you would do is unravel this ring enough to get back to the start of that chain, and then do like we did before. Tie on your shuttle and continue your pattern, making your next ring to make that join again. But if you want to continue cutting that off, you want to just make sure that the previous round that you're cutting off, you don't damage any of those connecting picots. Only work with the round that you're going to get rid of. Lots of options for working with ends, because there are lots of different projects that situations are going to come up with where you might have to deal with ends. But don't be intimidated. There's always a way to deal with the ends. The main thing is you want to make sure, think about the stress that's going to be on the tatting once you finish. And as long as you secure the ends against that stress, then things will be fine. I hope I've answered some of your questions about what to do with ends as you are practicing your rings and chains. And I thank you for watching.